Who truly rules the world? At first, the answer seems obvious. Kings once claimed the power. Presidents and parliaments claim it today. Empires rise, armies march, borders move on a map. History, at least on the surface, appears to be written by those who hold power. But ancient writers were not so certain. Long before modern nations debated politics and governance, some of the oldest religious texts asked a much stranger question. What if the rulers we see are not the rulers who matter most? What if history is shaped by forces that operate far beyond human courts and capitals? Hidden within ancient traditions is a very different picture of how the world works. In that picture, the universe is not random. It is structured, ordered, governed through layers of authority that extend far beyond human power. Some texts describe a reality where spiritual beings were assigned roles within creation itself, watching over nature, guiding nations, maintaining balance in ways most people never see. It sounds almost impossible, but the idea appears again and again in ancient writings. In this worldview, earthly authority is only the surface of something deeper. Beneath politics, beneath armies, beneath the rise and fall of empires, there may exist a system of governance older than civilization itself, a system where power flows downward through a hierarchy established at the beginning of creation. And if that idea is even partially true, it changes the way we understand history, because it would mean that the story of humanity is not only about kings, wars, and revolutions. It may also be about obedience and rebellion within an unseen order, one that shapes the fate of nations in ways we rarely notice. Stay with us, because as we explore these ancient writings, we'll uncover a possibility that is both unsettling and strangely hopeful. The world may not be ruled by chaos or hidden conspiracies at all. It may be governed by something far more profound, a moral architecture of power that has been quietly guiding history from the very beginning. And the question is, have we been looking for the rulers of the world in the wrong place all along? Imagine standing in the middle of a desert thousands of years ago, looking up at the night sky. No cities, no electric lights, just an ocean of stars stretching across the darkness. For ancient people, that sky did not look random. It looked organized. The stars rose and set with perfect rhythm. The seasons returned on time. The winds followed patterns. Rivers flooded and retreated in cycles that seemed almost deliberate. And so a question slowly formed in the minds of ancient writers. What if the universe was not simply a collection of natural forces? What if it was governed? Many ancient traditions imagined creation not as chaos, but as a kingdom, a realm structured by authority and responsibility. In this vision, God was not only the creator of the universe, he was its ruler, but not a ruler who micromanaged every detail. Instead, authority flowed outward from the center. Power was delegated. Responsibility was assigned. The universe functioned more like an administration than a machine. Ancient texts sometimes describe a hierarchy that looks almost like a royal court. At the highest level stands the creator. Below him, powerful heavenly beings often described as archangels. Below them are the spiritual authorities assigned specific responsibilities within creation. Some traditions say certain angels oversaw the movement of the stars. Others maintained the boundaries of oceans and winds. Still others were believed to watch over human nations. It is a vision of reality that can feel strangely familiar, because the structure resembles something we understand very well: a kingdom. In a kingdom, the king does not personally manage every village and field. Instead, governors, stewards, and administrators carry out the king's will across the land. Ancient writers often describe the universe in a similar way. One of the clearest glimpses of this idea appears in a passage from the Hebrew Scriptures. Psalm 82 opens with a striking image. God stands in the divine council. He renders judgment among the gods. To modern readers, the language can feel strange, but in the ancient world, the image was recognizable. It described a royal council. Just as earthly kings surrounded themselves with advisors and officials, the supreme ruler of creation was imagined as presiding over a council of heavenly beings entrusted with responsibility. Scholars today sometimes refer to this worldview as the divine council. It appears in several ancient Jewish writings from the period known as the Second Temple era, roughly the centuries before the time of Jesus. These texts do not suggest that God had rivals. Instead, they describe a universe where authority is structured, where spiritual beings participate in maintaining the order of creation. In that framework, history becomes something more than a chain of human decisions. It becomes a record of how faithfully those entrusted with authority carry out their role. Some uphold the order they were given, others fail, and that failure can have consequences that ripple through the human world. But the idea of cosmic government also raises an uncomfortable question. If the universe truly operates through delegated authority, what happens when those entrusted with that authority make the wrong choice? What happens when the rulers themselves rebel? Some ancient texts suggest that this is exactly what happened. They tell the story of a group of beings who were supposed to watch over humanity, but instead changed the course of history itself. And if those stories are even partially true, the problem of power in our world may have started far earlier than we imagine. Because before human kings ever fought for thrones, there may have been another rebellion, one that began not on earth, but among the very rulers of heaven itself. Imagine a group of rulers entrusted with protecting the world, suddenly deciding to abandon their duty. Not ordinary rulers, not kings or generals, but the very beings who were supposed to watch over humanity itself. According to several ancient texts, that is exactly where one of the oldest crises in history begins. In the worldview we just explored, the universe was structured through layers of authority. Certain heavenly beings were assigned responsibility within creation. They were meant to guide, oversee, and maintain the order established by the Creator. Among these beings were figures often referred to as the Watchers. The name itself is revealing. They were watchers because they observed humanity. They guarded the boundary between heaven and earth. Their role was not to dominate the human world, but to help preserve the balance of creation. But the story preserved in ancient writings takes a very different turn. Instead of remaining faithful to their role, a group of these watchers chose something else. They descended. One text describes them gathering on the slopes of a mountain known as Mount Hermon, a rugged peak that rises along the border of modern Lebanon and Syria. According to the accounts, 200 of these beings came together there and made a pact. Their leader was called Samyaza. The text describes a moment of hesitation among them. Some feared the consequences of breaking the order they had been given, so they swore an oath together, binding themselves to the same decision. Once the oath was made, there was no turning back. They crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. The ancient writers describe what followed in surprisingly concrete terms. The Watchers did not simply interact with humanity. They began teaching them things, and the knowledge they introduced changed human society in ways that would never be reversed. One of the most prominent figures in this story is a watcher named Azazel. According to the text, Azazel revealed skills that had previously been unknown to humanity. He taught people how to craft weapon swords, knives, shields, and armor, knowledge that could be used for protection, but also for domination and war. Other watchers introduced different kinds of knowledge. Some taught astrology, others revealed enchantments and rituals. Some taught the secrets of metallurgy and the manipulation of natural materials. The idea behind these stories is not simply that humans learned new skills. It is that the knowledge came at the wrong time and for the wrong reasons. Instead of guiding humanity toward wisdom, the Watchers accelerated power without restraint, and power without restraint rarely ends well. According to the narrative, the consequences soon became visible. Violence increased, human society became more chaotic, and the texts introduce one of the most mysterious elements of the entire story, the appearance of beings known as the Nephilim. These figures are described as powerful and enormous, the offspring of the Watchers and human women. The texts portray them as destructive forces that consumed resources, devastated the land, and spread fear among human communities. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the message of the story is clear. The rebellion of the Watchers did not remain a private act. It reshaped the world. The order of creation once meant to guide humanity toward balance began to fracture. Ancient writers looked at the violence and corruption of their own societies and asked a troubling question. What if the problem of power did not begin with human kings? What if the corruption of authority began earlier, among the very beings entrusted with maintaining the order of the world? But the story does not end there. Because if some of the rulers assigned to watch over humanity had fallen into rebellion, another question immediately follows. Who or what remains responsible for guiding the nations of the earth now? And if unseen rulers still influence the course of history, how might their presence shape the rise and fall of entire civilizations? That question leads us to one of the most intriguing ideas preserved in ancient tradition, the possibility that behind every empire there may be powers at work that most people never see. Imagine watching the rise of an empire from a distance. Cities grow, armies expand, kings make decisions that shape the lives of millions. From the outside, it all seems human, political, strategic, but ancient writers sometimes wondered if something deeper might also be at work. Not replacing human decisions, but influencing them. Not visible on the surface, but present behind the scenes. Several ancient texts suggest a surprising possibility that nations themselves may exist within a wider spiritual structure. One of the most intriguing glimpses of this idea appears in a passage from the book of Daniel. The story describes a mysterious encounter during a time of intense political upheaval. The Jewish people were living under the rule of powerful empires, first Babylon, then Persia. In the middle of that turbulent moment, Daniel receives a message from a heavenly messenger, but the messenger says something unexpected. He explains that his journey to deliver the message was delayed, not by distance, not by weather, but by a conflict with a figure described as the Prince of Persia. At first glance, the phrase sounds like a political title, but the text makes it clear that this prince is not a human ruler. The conflict takes place in the spiritual realm, beyond the reach of ordinary politics. Later in the same passage, another figure appears, the Prince of Greece. Again, not a human king, not Alexander or any general. Instead, these figures seem to represent something else entirely. Many scholars believe these passages reflect an ancient idea that powerful spiritual beings were connected in some way to the rise and fall of nations. In this worldview, earthly empires did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger structure of authority. Just as cities have governors and kingdoms have kings, the ancient imagination pictured nations existing within a wider cosmic administration. Some spiritual beings were believed to watch over particular peoples. Others may have opposed them. The text itself does not explain every detail. It simply pulls back the curtain for a moment, revealing a glimpse of a struggle that most humans never see. And that glimpse changes the way history can be understood. Because if spiritual authorities are connected to nations, then the rise of an empire may involve more than economic strength or military power. It may also reflect alignment or conflict within a deeper structure of order. But the ancient writers were careful about one thing. They never portrayed these powers as independent rulers of the universe. Even when describing conflict between spiritual authorities, the texts consistently emphasize that ultimate authority still belongs to the Creator. Any power exercised by lesser beings is limited, temporary, subject to judgment. This point becomes especially important when ancient texts discuss corruption and rebellion. Some powers may misuse their authority. Some may influence nations toward injustice or violence, but their influence does not last forever. In the worldview preserved in these writings, history moves toward a moment when corrupt powers are confronted and their authority removed. This idea offers a very different perspective from the way people often talk about hidden power today. The ancient texts do not describe a secret group permanently controlling the world. Instead, they describe a universe where authority can be misused but never permanently stolen. And that distinction matters, because it means that even when injustice appears powerful, it does not represent the final structure of reality. The struggle between justice and corruption, between faithful authority and rebellious power, becomes part of a much larger story. A story unfolding across generations, kingdoms, and civilizations. But that still leaves an unsettling question. If hidden powers can influence nations, And if rebellion among spiritual rulers once changed the course of human history, then what exactly happens when knowledge itself becomes part of that struggle? What happens when the tools that shape civilization are introduced not through wisdom, but through rebellion? Because according to some ancient traditions, the greatest change the Watchers brought to humanity was not simply their presence. It was the knowledge they left behind. Imagine the moment when a tool changes everything. A piece of metal shaped into a blade, a formula that turns simple minerals into weapons, a set of skills that suddenly allows one group of people to dominate another. Throughout history, new knowledge has often brought both progress and danger. But some ancient texts offer a far more unsettling idea. They suggest that certain kinds of knowledge entered human civilization under the wrong circumstances, from beings who had already rebelled against the order they were meant to protect. According to these writings, the Watchers did not simply cross a boundary between heaven and earth. They began teaching. And what they taught reshaped the course of human history. One of the most frequently mentioned figures in this story is Zazel. Ancient passages describe him revealing techniques that had previously been hidden from humanity. Among them was the knowledge of metallurgy used for weapons. The text says that Azazel taught people how to make swords, knives, shields, and armor. Now, metalworking itself is not portrayed as evil. Tools can build cities, harvest crops, and protect communities. But in the narrative, the concern is not the material. It is the timing and the intention behind its introduction. Power arrived before wisdom, and once power spreads faster than restraint, violence often follows. Other Watchers are said to have taught different kinds of knowledge. Some introduced forms of astrology, helping people interpret the movements of the stars in ways that could shape decisions and beliefs. Others revealed charms, enchantments, and practices connected to hidden forces. The texts describe these teachings almost like doors opening all at once. Suddenly, humanity possessed abilities that could transform society, and transformation did happen. According to the ancient narrative, human communities began to change rapidly. Competition increased. Conflict intensified. The pursuit of dominance replaced the pursuit of balance. Violence, the texts say, filled the earth. For the writers who preserved these stories, the point was not simply to blame knowledge itself. Instead, they were wrestling with a deeper question. What happens when knowledge becomes detached from moral responsibility? Technology, skill, and discovery can shape civilizations, but when they are guided by pride or ambition instead of wisdom, they can also accelerate corruption. Ancient authors looked at the turmoil of their own societies, war, injustice, exploitation, and wondered whether the roots of those problems might stretch further back than human politics alone. Perhaps the misuse of power began earlier. Perhaps the rebellion of the Watchers introduced patterns of domination that humanity then repeated generation after generation. But the story does not leave humanity trapped inside that corruption forever. The same text that described forbidden knowledge also describes something else: judgment. The Watchers who broke their trust were not portrayed as permanent rulers of the world. Their actions had consequences. The authority they misused would eventually be taken away. And this is where the narrative begins to shift. Because if the spread of corrupted knowledge disrupted the order of creation, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who restores that order? How does a world shaped by rebellion return to balance? To answer that question, the ancient writings introduce another remarkable idea. They suggest that history itself may be structured not random, not chaotic, but guided through cycles that move toward justice and restoration. In other words, even time may not be as accidental as it seems. Imagine a fragile manuscript resting on a wooden table inside a quiet mountain monastery. The ink is faded. The parchment is centuries old. Outside, the world is changing: empires rising, religions spreading, ideas evolving. And yet somehow this text survives, copied carefully by hand, passed from one generation to the next, protected through centuries when countless other writings disappeared. It raises an interesting question. If the ideas we have been exploring were once part of ancient religious traditions, why did so many people stop talking about them? Why do these stories about heavenly councils, rebellious watchers, and spiritual authorities connected to nations become so unfamiliar in later centuries? The answer is not as simple as people often imagine. Ancient religious communities preserved many different writings. Some became widely accepted as sacred scripture. Others circulated alongside them, respected by some groups, questioned by others. Over time, as religious traditions organized their official collections of sacred texts, certain writings were included, while others were gradually left outside the main canon. This process unfolded slowly across generations. Different communities made different decisions. What one tradition preserved, another sometimes set aside, but that does not mean the ideas vanished. Fragments of these traditions continued to appear in early Jewish and Christian literature. Some early Christian writers were clearly familiar with stories about the Watchers and the rebellion of heavenly beings. Certain themes, cosmic judgment, divine counsels, and the accountability of spiritual powers, continued to echo through theological reflection for centuries. Still, many of the detailed narratives faded from common discussion. History moved on. Empires collapsed, libraries burned, languages changed, and like many ancient traditions, some of these writings simply became less visible over time. But they did not disappear completely. In a few places, the older worldview continued to be preserved with remarkable care. Texts were copied again and again by scribes who believed they were safeguarding an important part of their spiritual heritage. In monasteries and religious communities, these manuscripts were treated not as curiosities, but as living witnesses to an ancient understanding of how the world works. Because of that quiet preservation, modern readers can still encounter a worldview that once shaped the imagination of entire communities. A worldview in which history is not merely a sequence of political events. It is part of a much larger story, a story about authority entrusted, authority misused, and authority ultimately restored. What makes this tradition so fascinating is that it refuses to separate spiritual reality from human history. For the ancient writers who preserved these texts, the struggles of nations were never purely political. They reflected deeper questions about justice, responsibility, and the proper use of power. In that sense, these writings were not only describing the past, they were offering a framework for understanding the present, and perhaps even the future. Because if the universe truly operates according to a structure of delegated authority, if spiritual rebellion once disrupted that order, and if corrupted knowledge helped shape human civilization, then history itself may not be moving randomly through time. It may be unfolding within a pattern that eventually leads to accountability and restoration. And that brings us to one of the most intriguing ideas preserved in these ancient traditions: the possibility that time itself, just like power, may follow a hidden structure built into the fabric of creation. Imagine standing at the edge of a field just before sunrise. The air is quiet, the horizon slowly brightens, and somewhere in the distance, birds begin their morning calls. Every day the sun rises, every year the sun rises. Every year the seasons return. Winter fades into spring, spring into summer, summer into autumn. For most of us, these rhythms feel so ordinary that we rarely question them. But ancient writers noticed something remarkable about time. It behaves with extraordinary precision. The movements of the sun, the cycles of the moon, the turning of the seasons, these patterns unfold with such consistency that ancient civilizations built their calendars, harvests, and religious festivals around them. And so a deeper question began to emerge. What if time itself is not simply flowing forward at random? What if it is structured? Some ancient traditions suggested exactly that. They described time as something woven into the fabric of creation itself, not chaotic, not accidental, but ordered according to patterns established from the very beginning. Certain texts speak of time unfolding through sacred cycles, periods that repeat, reflect, and mirror one another. In this view, history is not simply a long line stretching endlessly into the future. It has rhythm. It moves through phases. Moments of corruption are followed by moments of correction. Periods of rebellion eventually lead to judgment and restoration. For the writers who preserved these ideas, time was not only a measurement of days and years, it was part of the moral architecture of the universe. Just as authority was entrusted to rulers, both earthly and heavenly, time itself was believed to operate within the same ordered system. Some traditions even describe heavenly beings assigned to observe or maintain aspects of this order. Their task was not to control time, but to witness and ensure that creation continued to move according to the structure given to it. This perspective changes the way history can be understood. If time itself carries structure, then the events unfolding within history may also follow patterns that extend beyond human planning. Empires may rise quickly and collapse just as suddenly. Periods of peace may give way to conflict, only to be followed again by renewal. To ancient thinkers, these movements were not always random. They reflected the tension between order and rebellion that we explored earlier. When societies align themselves with justice, humility, and wisdom, they participate in the deeper order of creation. When they pursue domination, pride, or corruption, they move against that order and the consequences eventually follow. The point of these traditions is not to claim that humans can predict the exact timeline of history. Ancient writers themselves often emphasized that the full pattern remains hidden from human understanding, but they insisted on something else, that history moves toward accountability. The rebellion of the Watchers would not remain unresolved forever. The misuse of power, whether by spiritual beings or human rulers, would ultimately face judgment. And if that is true, then time itself becomes part of the restoration process, not merely a sequence of passing years, but the stage on which justice slowly unfolds. This idea leads us back to the question that began our journey. If power can be misused, if knowledge can be corrupted, and if unseen forces may influence the course of nations, who ultimately governs the direction of history? The ancient texts we've explored point toward a surprising answer. Not the rulers who dominate headlines, not the empires that appear invincible for a moment, but the deeper order established at the beginning of creation, an order that patiently works through time, moving history toward restoration. And that leaves us with one final question. If the true structure of power is rooted in justice, humility, and alignment with that deeper order, then what kind of rulers truly shape the future of the world? Imagine looking back across thousands of years of human history. Empires rise with incredible confidence, cities expand, kings declare their rule will last forever, and for a moment it almost seems true. But then something changes. The empire weakens. The ruler disappears from the stage of history. The power that once seemed permanent becomes a paragraph in a history book. It has happened again and again. Babylon once looked unstoppable. Persia dominated vast regions of the ancient world. Later, Greece rose with astonishing speed. Then Rome built an empire that stretched across continents. Each one appeared powerful in its time, and yet none of them remained forever. Ancient writers noticed this pattern long before modern historians began studying it. They watched kingdoms rise, flourish, and collapse, and they asked a question that still feels surprisingly relevant. Why does power fade? The ancient traditions we have explored offer an answer that is very different from the explanations we usually hear. They do not say history is controlled by a hidden cabal. They do not claim that the world is simply ruled by chaos. Instead, they describe history as unfolding within a deeper framework, a moral structure. In this framework, authority is never truly owned by human rulers. It is entrusted. Just as the Watchers were entrusted with responsibility and later misused it, human leaders are also given authority that carries accountability. Power is not the final measure of legitimacy. Justice is. One early Christian thinker expressed this idea in a striking way. Augustine of Hippo once wrote, "A kingdom without justice is nothing but a great robbery." The statement may sound harsh, but it captures the ancient perspective remarkably well. From this viewpoint, a kingdom may appear strong while it dominates others through force. It may control territory, resources, and armies, but if its power is built on injustice, it stands on unstable ground, because power separated from justice eventually collapses under its own weight. This is not simply a political theory. For the ancient writers, it was a theological observation about the structure of reality. They believed that the universe itself was ordered around principles of truth, humility, and righteousness. When rulers align themselves with that order, their authority participates in something stable and enduring. When rulers reject it, they may gain influence for a time, but the structure of reality itself eventually works against them. This helps explain why ancient texts often portray corrupt powers as temporary. Even when rebellion spreads, whether through spiritual beings like the Watchers or through human rulers driven by pride, the texts consistently emphasize that their authority is limited. It exists only within the larger system governed by the Creator, and eventually it faces judgment. That judgment is not always immediate. History can move slowly. Generations may pass before consequences become visible. But within the worldview preserved in these traditions, the direction of history is not uncertain. It moves toward restoration. The misuse of power is exposed. Corrupt rulers lose their influence. The order of creation damaged by rebellion begins to be repaired. This perspective changes the way we understand the struggle for power throughout history. Instead of asking only who holds authority, the ancient writers ask a deeper question. What kind of authority is it? Is it rooted in domination or in service? Is it driven by pride or by humility? Is it aligned with a deeper order of creation or working against it? Because according to these ancient traditions, the true rulers of the world are not always the ones who appear strongest. The ones who dominate headlines may seem powerful for a moment, but the rulers who truly shape the course of history are those who align themselves with the deeper structure of reality itself. In the end, the ancient texts point toward a paradox. The world is not ruled by those who grasp power most aggressively. It is shaped by those who understand where power actually comes from. And that leaves us with one final thought to consider. If history truly unfolds within a moral architecture, if authority ultimately flows toward justice rather than domination, then perhaps the most important question is not who rules the world today, but who is learning to rule it wisely for tomorrow.